January 2nd, 1967, North Vietnamese MiG pilots confidently dived in to strike the American bomber formation. But in the blink of an eye, the hunters became the hunted. IT was a perfect trap. The North Vietnamese Ground Control Intercept. GCI, crew at Phu Can Air Base huddled around their radar screens, watching the familiar electronic signatures gradually dancing across their displays. Everything matched the pattern they had seen dozens of times before: the jamming signals, the formation's trajectory, and the scheduled flight path, all unfolding right on schedule. It was another predictable bombing run by the slow and cumbersome American F-105 Thunderchiefs, heading straight toward Hanoi. Sitting in their control room, the operators remained composed. These aircraft were sitting ducks for North Vietnam's lethal MiG-21 interceptors. Ground control quickly vectored a squadron of MiGs toward the incoming formation, fully expecting to add another victory to their growing tally. But as the sleek, Soviet-built MiG-21s burst through the clouds into attack position, their pilots were suddenly faced with an unpleasant surprise. These were no bombers. They were F-4 Phantoms, the most lethal fighters in the U.S. Air Force. The Americans had set a trap, and the MiGs had flown straight into it. September 30th, 1966. A U.S. Air Force Seek-130 Hercules roared down the runway, coming to a stop at the far end of the Royal Thai Air Force Base in Ubon. The ramp lowered, and stepping onto the blistering tarmac was Colonel Robin Olds, a World War II ace pilot, born in Honolulu. He and his crew found themselves stranded, standing on a piece of hot concrete, a mile away from ops, the sun beating on us from a brassy sky. It was hardly a grand arrival for the new commander of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing, famously known as the Wolfpack. But Olds had little time to dwell on formalities. The situation in the skies over Southeast Asia was dire. For the past 9 months, since the North Vietnamese introduced the agile MiG-21 interceptor, the United States and its allies had faced increasing challenges in securing air superiority against their communist adversaries. Designed in the Soviet Union, the MiG-21 was small and incredibly maneuverable, making it nearly impossible for American pilots to spot, even when they knew it was there. It was built for speed, capable of supersonic acceleration and high-altitude performance. In Vietnam, MiG-21s executed rapid hit and run attacks using heat-seeking missiles, directed by ground control, to ambush the slow-moving Republic F-105 Thunderchiefs. These bombers were assigned to carry out Operation Rolling Thunder, the sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam. Nicknamed Thuds, the F-105s were heavily loaded with ordnance, making them easy prey for the nimble MiGs, as well as North Vietnamese anti-aircraft defenses and surface-to-air missiles, which shot them down with alarming regularity. Yet Olds knew that F-105s weren't the only aircraft suffering losses. The McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom I was supposed to be America's ultimate air superiority weapon, a powerful fighter, loaded with 8 air-to-air missiles, and engineered to engage enemies beyond visual range. But reality told a different story. Engagement rules required pilots to visually identify their targets before launching the radar-guided AIM-7 Sparrow missiles, nullifying their long-range advantage. Worse still, the F-4's engines emitted thick, dark smoke trails, turning them into obvious targets for enemy pilots tracking them from afar. In just 6 months, the Wolfpack had lost 18 F-4 Phantoms, and 21 pilots had either been killed or declared missing in action. Just 5 days before Olds took command, the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing suffered its first confirmed loss to a MiG, a sobering demonstration of the growing capabilities of the North Vietnamese Air Force. The young pilots at Ubon initially observed their new commander with a mix of admiration, curiosity, and unease. During World War II, while piloting the P-38 Lightning and P-51 Mustang over Europe, Robin Olds had secured 13 confirmed air-to-air victories against the Luftwaffe, and had also been credited with destroying 11.5 enemy aircraft on the ground, including one shared victory. By the time he was 22, He had already reached the rank of major. However, Olds quickly became known as a hot-headed, hard-drinking maverick, frequently clashing with his superiors. His rebellious streak ultimately cost him the opportunity to see combat in the Korean War. As the 1950s progressed, he was increasingly seen as a relic of a bygone era. The era of dogfighting, once considered the pinnacle of aerial combat, was now dismissed as obsolete, replaced by intercontinental ballistic missiles and strategic bombers. His steadfast belief in the importance of head-to-head aerial engagements often made him a target of derision from the Air Force top brass. A general once made it clear to him that the days of traditional air battles were over, stating bluntly that the Air Force was never again going to fight a conventional war. Despite his deep frustrations with Air Force leadership, Olds was ultimately persuaded to stay by a mentor. And now, 22 years later, he was back in action. Among the Wolfpack pilots, Lieutenant Ralph Wareham recalled that they had all heard of Olds and were eager to meet the legendary fighter pilot. However, after so many years away from the front lines, Olds had catching up to do. He had never flown an F-4 Phantom before in his life. Yet, upon his arrival, he wasted no time in making his stance clear. In his signature no-nonsense approach, he addressed his pilots directly, telling them that he was the new guy and that there was a lot he had to learn from them. But in just 2 or 3 weeks, he assured them he would outfly them all. And when that happened, they would be the ones in trouble. True to his word, Olds refused to lead from behind a desk. Instead, he flew at the rear of formations, just like a rookie second lieutenant, methodically mastering the F-4 Phantom. Within a few weeks, he had already surpassed expectations and was leading missions from the front. The pilots quickly came to realize that this swaggering World War II veteran was exactly what the Wolfpack needed. Wareham would later remark that Olds was the real deal. At the time, most of the pilots had never received proper air-to-air combat training, making them vulnerable in dogfights against the North Vietnamese MiG. Olds understood that this was not their fault. The Air Force's doctrine had long dismissed the importance of dogfighting, favoring missile technology over traditional aerial maneuvering. Olds acknowledged that their training had neglected essential combat skills such as strafing, dive bombing, and rocketry, considering them unnecessary in modern warfare. To fix this, he turned to Captain Everett Raspberry, one of the Wolfpack's most experienced pilots, and gave him a direct task. He needed Raspberry to train the younger pilots, as many of them had little knowledge of air-to-air combat, dogfighting tactics, or even how to use their missiles effectively. However, even Raspberry himself had never actually fired a missile from an F-4 Phantom before. Olds had a monumental task ahead of him. Despite the challenges, he could see that what the Wolfpack pilots lacked in training, they made up for in sheer enthusiasm. There was, as he later put it, a spark of morale at the squadron level, something that could be forged into an unbreakable spirit. The Wolfpack had heart. Despite the enthusiasm and determination of his pilots, Olds knew that improving the situation for U.S. aviators in Vietnam would require more than just a positive attitude. The mounting casualties pointed to a critical flaw in U.S. bombing strategy missions, followed predictable routes at the same times, making American aircraft easy targets. The North Vietnamese had become experts at recognizing the electronic signatures and radio frequencies of the F-105 Thunderchiefs. Their ground control intercept, GCI, teams would vector MiG-21 squadrons into perfect ambush positions against incoming American bombers. It didn't take long for Olds to realize that this rigid approach was directly responsible for the heavy losses suffered by the U.S. Air Force. He later reflected that even as a newcomer to the war, he knew that repeating the same tactics, along the same route, from the same direction, time after time, was a recipe for disaster. Having destroyed several enemy aircraft on the ground during World War II, Olds must have been tempted to eliminate the North Vietnamese MiGs while they were lined up on the tarmac at Bain Air Base, 19 miles north of Hanoi. However, this was strictly forbidden. The U.S. government feared that airstrikes on these airfields might result in accidental attacks on Soviet or Chinese officials, risking direct military intervention by those nations. One evening, while reviewing intelligence reports with Captain J.N. Stone, his wing tactics officer, Olds grew frustrated. He voiced his irritation bluntly, declaring that they needed to get those MiGs up in the air where we can get at them. Stone immediately proposed a bold idea. The MiGs consistently targeted vulnerable F-105 bombers, but rarely engaged F-4 Phantoms, recognizing them as a far more formidable threat. What if they could disguise Phantoms as Thunder Chiefs, luring the MiGs into the air only to ambush them instead? Olds loved the idea. It was bold, unconventional, and aggressive, perfectly aligning with his combat philosophy. The two men immediately set about planning the ruse. To sell the deception, the F-4 Phantoms would be equipped with the Kirk 160 radar jamming pods, used by the F-105s, follow the same flight paths, use the same radio frequencies, and maintain the same rigid formations. Everything would mirror a typical bombing run, except the Phantoms would be armed for air-to-air combat instead of carrying bombs. The North Vietnamese wouldn't realize the truth until it was too late. Under Old's direction, Stone continued planning the operation in complete secrecy, working alongside Lieutenant Joseph Hicks and Major James D. Covington. The F-4's from UBAN's 8th Tactical Fighter Wing would serve as the West Force, impersonating F-105s, while the 366th Tactical Fighter Wing at Day Midang would act as the East Force, preventing escaping MiGs from reaching Chinese airspace. The trap would involve more than just the Phantoms. The EB-66 destroyers would provide radar jamming support, while EC-121 Warning Stars would maintain constant radar surveillance over the combat zone. These aircraft would be escorted by F-104 starfighters from the 435th Tactical Fighter Squadron. To ensure the mission's success, no other U.S. aircraft would be allowed in the area, giving the first 3 flights of F-4s the rare ability to fire their AIM-7 Sparrow missiles without first identifying their targets, a temporary suspension of the standard rules of engagement. The planners calculated the MiGs' fuel endurance once airborne. They would only have 55 minutes before running out of fuel. The F-4 flights, each composed of 4 Phantoms, would arrive over 4 different North Vietnamese air bases near Hanoi, precisely 5 minutes apart, ensuring continuous coverage and denying any escaping MiGs a chance to land. Any MiG that wasn't shot down would be forced to stay in the air until it ran out of fuel and crashed. However, several technical obstacles had to be overcome. Mounting the Kirk 160 jammers on the F-4's fuel tank pylons created a dangerous asymmetric imbalance, making the Phantoms prone to rolling on takeoff. This demanded extreme skill from the pilots. Additionally, both the AIM-7 Sparrow and AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles used by the F-4 had proven unreliable in Southeast Asia's humid climate, with many failing to ignite, fuse, or track their targets. Yet, with time running out, the Wolfpack would have to make the best of what they had. On December 22nd, the proposal was submitted to 7th Air Force Commander General William Maumier for approval. Maumier immediately approved the plan, setting the mission date for January 1, 1967. The operation was given the code name Bolo, after the Filipino machete, a farming tool that doubled as a deadly weapon just like their deception strategy. To maintain tight security, the pilots participating in Bolo were only briefed on December 30th, just 2 days before the mission. The plan was in place, but the weather over Hanoi refused to cooperate. The next morning, heavy cloud cover remained, with solid clouds up to 7,000 feet. Some officers suggested delaying the mission, but Olds disagreed. He believed that poor visibility would work to their advantage, making it more difficult for the North Vietnamese to recognize the deception until it was too late. As the air crews prepared for takeoff, Olds gave his men a final command. "Okay, Wolfpack, go get him." Moments later, the F-4 Phantoms roared into the sky, deliberately mimicking the sluggish, bomb-laden movements of F-105 Thunder Chiefs. As they cruised over Laos, 6 Keek 135 Stradinkers topped off their fuel tanks. Then, Old's flight peeled away, crossing the Black River at the northwestern corner of North Vietnam, before turning southeast along the 5,000-foot ridgeline, known as Thud Ridge. The same path F-105 bombing runs had taken countless times before. At 3 p.m. Old's formation approached Phan Air Base. His weapons officer, Lieutenant Charles Clifton, scanned the sky with radar, searching for signs of approaching MiGs, but nothing appeared. Doubt began to creep in. Had the North Vietnamese seen through the ruse? Then, suddenly, Lieutenant Joe Hicks' voice crackled over the radio. Radar contact. 17 miles ahead. A target moving fast and low. Olds immediately led his flight downward, but before they could engage, the contact vanished into the clouds. Though tempted to give chase, they couldn't afford to break formation. They had to stay in character as a bomber group. Then, just seconds later, Old's radio sprang to life again. This time it was Colonel Chappie James, leader of Forward Flight, with an urgent message. A MiG had turned around and was now directly behind Old's aircraft. The trap was about to be sprung. As the MiG emerged through the clouds behind Old's flight, more North Vietnamese fighters were already scrambling from their bases. Their GCI controllers, still convinced that they were engaging a formation of F-105 bombers, committed their entire force to the attack. Within minutes, the sky was swarming with MiGs, approaching from every direction, some head-on, others slicing in from the sides, and one diving down from 6 o'clock. By now, their pilots must have realized the truth: these were not bombers. For Robin Olds, who had never faced a MiG in combat before, this was the moment of truth. The North Vietnamese had taken the bait. Now, it was time for the Wolfpack to strike. Olds fired 2 AIM-7 Sparrow missiles at an incoming enemy aircraft, but both failed. One refused to launch, the other lost guidance. However, his wingman, Lieutenant Ralph Warehon, had better luck. His Sparrow missile hit its mark, catching a MiG squarely in its fuselage. The explosion sent the enemy interceptor spiraling downward, disappearing into the clouds. First blood to the Wolfpack. The battle immediately descended into chaos, a swirling melee of split-second decisions and high-speed maneuvers. As another MiG appeared at Olds 10 o'clock, the veteran ace's World War II instincts kicked in. He later described how he positioned himself for the kill, rolling half upside down, waiting for the enemy to complete his turn. As soon as Olds got behind him, the MiG was outlined against the bright blue sky. Without hesitation, he fired 2 AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles. One of them hit home, ripping off the MiG's right wing. Behind them, Captain Walter Radeker spotted another MiG pursuing his element leader in a lethal high-speed chase. He quickly maneuvered into position, locked onto the target, and fired a Sidewinder missile. The missile struck just in front of the MiG's tail, sending it spiraling out of control. In less than 5 minutes, Olds' F-4 Phantoms had downed 3 MiG-21s, all without taking a single significant hit. The Wolfpack had drawn first blood, but the battle was far from over. But the battle had only just begun. Colonel Chappie James' Forward Flight had now reached the target area, just as a fresh wave of enemy MiGs scrambled to engage. Within moments, 3 MiGs moved in 2 from 10 o'clock, another sneaking up from 6 o'clock. James focused on the frontal attack, nearly missing the threat from behind, until his weapons officer's urgent warning crackled through the radio. As he executed a defensive break, one of the MiGs turned in the same direction, flying side by side with him. For an instant, James could see the enemy pilot's face and the red stars on the MiG's wings. Without hesitation, he barrel rolled away, quickly maneuvering into an attack position, firing a Sidewinder missile. The MiG dodged left, causing the missile to miss, but the maneuver placed it directly in front of Captain Raz Raspberry in Ford 2. Seizing the moment, Raspberry pursued the MiG, tracking it through desperate evasive moves before locking onto the target. He fired a Sidewinder missile, striking the tail section. The North Vietnamese fighter spiraled downward and disappeared into the clouds. The pilot ejected, his parachute opening as his damaged aircraft fell away. Another enemy fighter was down, but the battle raged on. As Forward Flight cleared the combat zone, Captain John Stone led Rambler Flight into a chaotic sky filled with jet exhaust and missile trails. Looking through gaps in the cloud cover, Stone suddenly spotted 2 MiGs climbing rapidly into the clear blue sky. Without hesitation, he rolled his F-4 into a steep dive, locking onto the trailing enemy aircraft. His first AIM-7 Sparrow missile failed to ignite, but he kept his composure, quickly lining up another shot. This time, his radar-guided missile found its mark, striking the sleek MiG-21 and engulfing it in flames. Before he could process his victory, his wingman's urgent call came over the radio. Another MiG was on their tail. Acting swiftly, The two American pilots maneuvered the pursuing MiG into the line of fire of Major Philip Comer in Rambler 4. Flying at 13,440 feet, maintaining 540 knots, Comer was in an ideal attack position. He later recalled his decision in the heat of battle. "I decided to follow the Navy pilot's tactics at close range, ignoring radar tracking and using the reticle sight instead. A second later, I saw a huge orange ball of fire. Moments later, another MiG-21 crossed in front of Lieutenant Lawrence Glenn in Rambler 2. Glenn instinctively fired a Sparrow missile, which struck just behind the enemy's cockpit. The explosion was so close that his own F-4 shuddered from the blast. As the North Vietnamese pilot's parachute deployed, his crippled fighter spiraled down, trailing thick smoke and flames against the blue sky. The situation was becoming increasingly dangerous for the American pilots. Shortly after, Rambler flight narrowly dodged 5 North Vietnamese Sa-2 surface-to-air missiles. Recognizing the growing threat, the decision was made to disengage and return to base before suffering any losses. As they exited the combat area, the final 4 flights of F-4 Phantoms from the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing arrived only to find that the battle was already over. Meanwhile, the Da Nang-based East Force, after assessing the weather conditions, chose not to enter North Vietnamese airspace. Though only 26 of the 56 assigned aircraft had entered the target area, and only 12 had directly engaged the enemy, the mission had achieved its objective. As the F-4's returned to Yubin, they were greeted by ground crews lining the taxiway. One by one, as the pilots taxied in, they opened their cockpits and held up their fingers, signaling the number of MiGs they had downed. The mechanics, who had worked tirelessly to prepare the aircraft, were thrilled to see that their efforts had paid off. In just 12 minutes of combat, Operation Bolo had achieved a devastating victory without a single American loss. 7 MiG-21s had been shot down, almost half of the 16 MiGs that were in North Vietnamese service at the time. When asked if he was satisfied with the mission's success, Colonel Robin Olds simply grinned and responded that they had missed a pond. But Olds wasn't finished yet. Just 4 days later, he launched another deception mission. This time, his F-4 Phantoms posed as an F-4C retains flight, a routine mission that the North Vietnamese frequently intercepted. The strategy worked again. 4 MiGs scrambled to intercept what they believed was an unarmed reconnaissance plane, only to be ambushed by Phantoms, which shot down 2 of them. These consecutive defeats forced the North Vietnamese and their Soviet advisors into a complete reassessment of their air combat tactics. The remainder of their MiG-21 force was grounded for 4 months, while pilots underwent extensive retraining. However, when they returned to combat, they proved to be far more formidable opponents. Throughout 1967, North Vietnamese pilots would go on to shoot down 32 American aircraft, including 16 F-105s and several reconnaissance planes. The casualty rate could have been even worse had it not been for Operation Bolo, which forced the North Vietnamese to become more cautious and strategic in their engagements. Colonel Robin Olds continued to lead from the front in the months that followed, adding 3 more MiG kills to his record, making him a triple ace. He became the only pilot to score victories in both World War II and Vietnam. His greatest success, however, was not just his individual triumphs, it was his transformation of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing from a demoralized unit into the most effective meat-killing force in Southeast Asia. Years later, Major General Don Lon, who had flown under Olds in the 555th Tactical Fighter Squadron, described his impact. He believed that Robin Olds was born for combat, not for a Pentagon desk, and said he would have followed Olds into battle over Hanoi in 1967, even if they had been armed with only .45 caliber pistols. Olds' time as commander of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing ended in September 1967. He was soon appointed Commandant of Cadets at the U.S. Air Force Academy, where he inspired future generations of American aviators. In 1973, he officially retired from the Air Force with the rank of Brigadier General. If you enjoyed this deep dive into aviation history, don't forget to subscribe to FLYTOP for more incredible stories of courage, strategy, and aerial combat. Stay tuned, our next episode will reveal a high-stakes mission that changed air warfare forever.